Nguma Monene, the shadow in the Congo. There are places on Earth where maps stop meaning much. Not because the land disappears, but because it becomes too vast, too dense, too uninterested in being known. The Congo Basin is one of those places. A stretch of rainforest so large that entire countries could disappear inside it without leaving a trace. Rivers twist through it like dark veins. From above, it looks endless. From inside, it feels endless in a very different way. Like something that has no intention of ever letting you go. Out here, distance is not measured in kilometers. It is measured in effort, in silence, in how long it takes before you realize you are no longer sure where you are. And in the deeper regions, where the forest thickens and the swamps take over from solid ground, there are stories that refuse to fade even when everything else has changed. One of those stories is about Nguma Monene. Most outsiders first hear the name and assume it refers to a snake. The words themselves, depending on interpretation, can be translated loosely as the great serpent or the enormous one. But among the people who actually live along these waterways, the descriptions rarely match a snake at all. They speak instead of something bigger. Something that does not glide through grass, but forces its way through water. Something that does not coil around trees, but vanishes beneath the surface of rivers. And something that, when it does appear, makes even experienced hunters go quiet in a way that has nothing to do with superstition and everything to do with instinct. The descriptions vary from village to village, but the core details repeat with uncomfortable consistency. A massive reptilian form. A long, narrow snout. A body that stays mostly submerged. Powerful hindquarters that suggest explosive movement in water. And, most unsettling of all, a ridge or sail-like structure along its back that breaks the surface when it rises. To people familiar with prehistoric reconstructions, the shape is difficult to ignore. It resembles something that should not exist in modern Africa. Something closer to a spinosaurid than anything alive today. But in the Congo, comparisons to extinct animals are not made likely. Most witnesses are not referencing textbooks or museum exhibits. They are describing something they have seen in the only language available to them. Comparison to known animals, stretched until language itself begins to fail. And yet the stories persist. They persist across generations, across regions that have little contact with one another, and across cultures that do not always share the same names for what they fear. Long before modern cryptozoology ever took interest in the Congo, local hunters already knew certain waters were best avoided at specific times. Not because of crocodiles, which are well understood here. Not because of hippos, which are equally dangerous and equally familiar. But because of something else that occasionally disturbs the surface in ways that do not match anything catalogued by science. One of the earliest widely circulated accounts comes from fishermen traveling a remote tributary before dawn. The water was still black with night, and the fog had settled so thickly over the river that the far bank had disappeared completely. They had been moving slowly, using paddles, when the silence began to feel unusual. In a rainforest, silence is rarely absolute. Even at night there is movement, birds shifting in branches, insects buzzing, distant splashes of fish breaking the surface. That morning, there was none of it. Only the sound of water against wood. And then even that seemed to dull, as if the river itself was listening. One of the fishermen noticed a shape ahead, just where the fog was thickest. At first it looked like a half-submerged log drifting sideways across the current. But logs do not move with intent. Logs do not pause. This shape did. It rose slightly from the water, revealing something elongated beneath the mist. A suggestion of a head at the front, narrow and low. The kind of shape that might have been mistaken for a crocodile if it had not been for the proportions, too long, too streamlined, and sitting at an angle that did not match any known reptile in the region. One of the men later said he thought he saw a ridge along its back break the surface as it turned. Another insisted there was a moment when it looked directly at them. Not like a predator preparing to strike, but like something registering their presence with a kind of cold awareness. Then, without warning, it slipped beneath the water. No splash. No dramatic movement. Just gone. For several seconds nothing happened. Then the river changed. The surface beneath their canoe began to move in a way that did not match current or wind. A pressure built underneath them, subtle at first, then stronger, as if something large had passed directly below. The fisherman froze. And then the water erupted beside them. Not in a single strike, but in a rolling surge that lifted the canoe and nearly overturned it. Whatever had moved beneath them did not surface fully. It did not need to. The wake alone was enough to send them scrambling for balance and direction. They paddled without speaking until the river widened and the fog finally began to thin. None of them agreed afterward on how large the thing had been. Years later, another account would surface from deeper inland, in a region where the swamp spread so far that land and water begin to lose their meaning entirely. This time, it was not fishermen, but hunters, men accustomed to reading terrain, tracking animals, and recognizing danger long before it becomes visible. They had entered the swamp during a dry spell when the water had receded enough to expose wide stretches of mud. The kind of conditions that normally make hunting easier. Tracks become clearer. Movement becomes more predictable. Animals are forced into narrower channels. But almost immediately, something felt wrong. The forest was too quiet. Not just quiet in the absence of birdsong, but stripped of the usual background presence that defines a living jungle. Even insects seemed reduced. Even the wind felt muted. One of the hunters noticed the first tracks. They were enormous. Deep impressions in the mud that suggested weight far beyond anything they expected in the region. Each step was spaced too widely for a crocodile, too heavy for any known reptile. The men followed the trail. Not out of confidence, but because turning back without understanding what had left them felt worse than continuing. The tracks led them toward a hidden lagoon surrounded by dense vegetation that formed a natural wall. The kind of place you would not notice unless you were already looking for something. The water inside was still, almost unnaturally so. No ripples. No fish breaking the surface. No movement at all. Just a dark reflective plane sitting in the middle of the swamp like an eye that refused to blink. They stopped at the edge. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then the water moved. Not violently at first. Just a slow disturbance at the center, like something large shifting position beneath the surface. Then a shape began to rise. And that was when the silence broke. Because whatever had been hiding beneath that water was no longer trying to stay hidden. And it was coming up. It did not break the surface all at once. At first, it was only the head. Long, narrow, and lined with a jaw that seemed too light for the mass it implied. The snout cut through the water like something designed for hunting in silence rather than brute force. Then came the neck, rising slowly, as if the creature was testing how much of itself it needed to reveal before the swamp itself would react. And when the body finally followed, the hunters understood immediately that what they were seeing did not belong in the same category as anything they had ever tracked before. The animal was enormous, but not in the way elephants are enormous. It was stretched, elongated, built for water rather than land. Its body remained mostly submerged, but what could be seen suggested a frame built for power and movement beneath the surface rather than weight above it. Along its back, something broke the waterline, an uneven ridge or sail-like structure that disrupted the smooth outline of the swamp. One of the hunters would later describe it in a way that stayed with researchers who heard his account. He said it looked like the river had decided to grow teeth. For several seconds, the creature did not move toward them. It simply observed. There was no roaring, no dramatic display, only the slow, deliberate tension of something evaluating whether the small figures at the edge of its world were worth acknowledging at all. Then it moved. The water did not ripple the way it should have. It surged. The creature propelled itself forward with a sudden force that turned the entire lagoon into motion. The surface broke into violent waves as the massive form advanced without fully exposing itself. What followed was not a chase in the traditional sense, because the hunters never claimed it pursued them in a straight line. Instead, they described something far worse, a shifting presence in the water that seemed to move faster than their understanding of distance allowed. One of the men slipped in the mud before he even realized he was running. Another fell and was pulled back up without stopping. The forest became a blur of reeds and branches and shallow water as they fled in blind direction, guided only by the instinct to reach higher ground. Behind them, the lagoon erupted again. A sound roared across the swamp, not a roar, not a cry, but a deep, resonant force that seemed to come from the water itself. Some described it as pressure more than sound, something that vibrated through bone and chest rather than air. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. When they finally reached safety, none of them were fully willing to describe what they had seen in complete detail. Not because they disagreed, but because agreement itself made it feel more real than they were comfortable admitting. Still, the story spread. And it was not the only one. Across different regions of the Congo Basin, similar reports began to surface, each slightly different in detail but sharing the same unsettling structure. A large aquatic reptile. A crocodile-like head but with proportions that did not match any known species. A body that seemed too adapted to water to be easily observed on land. And, in many cases, a raised structure along the back that reminded some witnesses of a fin, and others of a sail. To outsiders, these inconsistencies were enough to dismiss the entire phenomenon as misidentification. Crocodiles, hippos, submerged logs, even drifting vegetation mats, each explanation could account for parts of the sightings if viewed at the right angle and under the right conditions. But within the region, people who had lived alongside crocodiles their entire lives did not confuse them lightly. And that is where the Nguma Monene problem becomes difficult. Because the witnesses are not inexperienced. They are not unfamiliar with danger. They are people who know exactly what a crocodile looks like when it moves through water, and exactly what a hippo sounds like when it surfaces at night. And yet they insist that what they saw was neither. In the decades that followed, occasional expeditions entered the deeper swamp regions attempting to investigate the reports. Most returned with little more than frustration. The Congo does not easily surrender evidence, and vast areas remain difficult to access even today. Still, a pattern emerged from collected testimonies. The creature, when described consistently, bore a striking resemblance not to modern reptiles, but to something far older. a semi-aquatic predator with adaptations that seemed almost designed for river hunting. Long snout, dense musculature in the torso, strong tail propulsion, and most intriguingly, a dorsal structure that varied between accounts but always suggested something elevated along the spine. This is where comparisons to Spinosaurus began to appear in cryptozoological discussions. Spinosaurus, as reconstructed from fossil evidence, was a large theropod dinosaur believed to have been highly adapted to aquatic environments. It had a long crocodile-like skull, conical teeth, and a body structure that suggests it may have spent much of its time in water. Some reconstructions even include a sail-like structure along its back, formed by elongated neural spines. To some researchers, Nguma Monene sounded uncomfortably similar. But similarity is not evidence. And even among those who take the report seriously, caution is necessary. The Congo Basin is a place where perception can be distorted by environment itself. Light behaves differently under dense canopy. Sound travels unpredictably over water. Large crocodiles can surface in ways that exaggerate their size, especially when only partially visible through fog or vegetation. There is also the psychological weight of expectation. Once a story exists, the human mind begins to shape new experiences around it. A shadow becomes a shape. A shape becomes a presence. A presence becomes a memory that feels more certain the more it is retold. And yet, there remains a persistent discomfort in dismissing all accounts so easily. Because not all witnesses describe vague impressions. Some describe encounters so specific that coincidence feels insufficient. One report, collected from a village situated near a wide swamp channel, describes a calm afternoon interrupted by unusual disturbances in the water. Fish were seen leaping erratically. Birds left the area in large numbers. Then the surface of the water began to shift in a way that suggested something large moving just beneath it. A canoe nearby was struck from below with enough force to nearly capsize it, even though nothing was seen breaking the surface. The occupants reported seeing a shadow pass directly beneath them that was far too large to be any known crocodile in the region. What frightened them most was not the impact itself, but the control behind it. It did not feel random. It felt deliberate. As if something in the water had tested them and decided they were not worth further attention. After that incident, the area was reportedly avoided by fishermen for months. No one officially documented what happened next. But in remote regions like this, documentation is not always how stories survive. They survive through repetition, through warning, through the quiet decision of people who choose not to return to certain places after sunset. Today, Nguma Monene remains one of the more controversial cryptid reports in African cryptozoology. Some classify it as a misunderstanding of known wildlife. Others believe it may represent an undiscovered species of large aquatic reptile. A smaller group continues to explore the more radical idea that something far older may still persist in isolated ecosystems. But there is no consensus. Only stories. And a handful of encounters that refuse to fit neatly into any explanation that feels complete. If you made it this far into the mystery, thanks for watching Mysteries from the Orb. If you're new here, don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on notifications, because there are plenty more stories waiting in the dark that you probably haven't heard yet. Until next time, stay curious.